I'd like to now welcome you to everyone who's joined us for the webinar today. And today's webinar is our 300th Call Center Helper webinar. We started in 2009, where we're looking at speech analytics, and 12 years later, we've clocked up 300. And so today we're looking at innovative best practices for first contact resolution. And I'm absolutely delighted to bring back three regular and popular speakers with us. Justin Robbins. Justin, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Johnny.
And you're a call center consultant amongst other roles, and you're going to be sharing with us some of your practical experience.
Absolutely.
Wonderful. Also delighted to welcome back a regular pundit with us, Martin Hill-Wilson from Brain Food Consulting.
Thank you very much, John T.
And you're going to be looking at the whole reason of what's driving repeat calls.
Yeah, particularly as we've added digital recently into our arsenal, and that being a way forward, but we've got to get some things right, because at the moment I suspect that that's one of the drivers to multiple points of contact.
Wonderful. And also welcome to Kristen Emeneka from Playbox. Welcome, Kristen. You're going to be talking through some of the ways that technology angle can help as well.
I will, and also touching on sort of both of those, right? You know, how we measure it and digital and the challenges through all of that, and yeah, what we can do from technology.
Wonderful. Well, as ever, a recording will be available at 45 minutes, callcenterhelper.com/reported webinars. No number of you do like to share them with your management team. Time now to log into the chat room. Very easy. Just type in cch.chat into your mobile phone or into your browser. The webinar slides are on one screen. You can get the chat room up on another screen, or you can get it on your mobile phone if you want to do that. We've got about 40 people logged into the chat rooms, which is just under half the number of people logged in so far. So time to do that. Also, you'll be able to download the webinar slides once you're logged in. Very simple, just hit this button, download the webinar slides. And then you've got these voting buttons at the bottom here for our quiz that we're going to be doing later. There is a bottle of champagne, a box of chocolates, an Amazon gift card, or a charitable donation for the best tip that anyone puts on about how to improve first contact resolution. So I know that's been very popular. And we're going to just start off by having a quick poll, and going to ask the question: what percentage of your contact volume are repeat contacts? Is it 0 to 4%, 5 to 9%, 10 to 24%, 25 to 49%, or is it actually the majority? Is it 50+% of contact volume? I was trying to work out that if you've got more than 50% of contact volume, that means you get more repeats than you are originals. So, and I think the only way that could actually be possible is if people are calling in 3 times into the contact center. So I think that's going to be fascinating to see that. We've got a number of people still yet to vote. So I'll just wait for those last couple of votes to come through. And here we are. Well, let's just share the results here. Well, the actual largest vote there is between 20 and 25% of contact volume, followed very closely by between 25 and 49% of contact volume, and 50% and above. Wow, for 7% of the audience. So we do have some people who've got very low contact volumes, so repeat contact volumes. So if there is a secret behind what you've done, if you'd like to put that as a tip into the chat room, using hashtag tip to put it into the chat room. Right, well, that's quite fascinating results there, Justin. Probably a good time to pass across to you and to share some of your words of wisdom. So,
yeah, happy to. Yeah, absolutely. And when we get started with this, I think it's important to visit 3 things, and that's really where I want to focus my time today. Number one is let's take a step back. And anytime we talk about metrics, I think there's a few fundamental things it's worth talking about. So we're going to start there. Then I want to level set this idea of first contact resolution. What do we actually mean when we use that term? One of the things I've discovered in my time is that there's a lot of ways to define it. There's even more ways to measure it. And so we've got to make that meaningful for each one of us on an individual level. And the thing I'm going to do to help us really begin the conversation is just pose a couple key questions that I think each of us should be asking ourselves as we walk away from the webinar today. So with that, I'm going to pop up and we're going to start with this first question that really helps us look at the value of the metrics that we have. And in other words, what's the reason for having them in the first place? So if we think about why do metrics exist, right? There's really three fundamental reasons that metrics exist. There's kind of three key things that they do for us and our businesses. The number one, and not because it's most important, but it's because where I chose to start, but the number one thing that I'd say that metrics do is they help us provide predictive indicators of success. In other words, they help us answer the question, are we on the right path? I'll give you an example. Johnny, I think you know this about me. Kristen, I think you know this about me, but I'm big into barbecue. I love cooking barbecue. I love competing with barbecue. And when you prepare barbecue, there are a couple things that you can do that are predictive indicators of success. It might be the temperature that you cook at, the length of time, the type of wood that you use, or even the rub, right? And when I do certain things, I do them because I expect that they're going to deliver a certain outcome, right? In the same way, our metrics, some of them are helping us determine the right outcomes. If we do this, it means we should achieve that, right? So that's number one of metrics. Are we on the right path? And for some of us, what we're going to find out is we might be using first contact resolution in a kind of a smaller view of the entire customer experience. And I know Kristen and Martin are going to touch on this, but it really comes down to, is this predictive of their entire experience being great? Or is this measuring that their entire experience was great? So we'll talk a bit more about that as we go on. Second thing that I think of when we look at metrics is they can look back, right? They can be these reflective measures. In other words, were we successful? So for me in barbecue, that's this idea of after all of this time has gone by, people are going to taste it. And whether or not they liked it, that's an indication of my predictive measures if they were the right thing. So in the same way, if we're saying we're trying to achieve a certain level of customer satisfaction or employee engagement or reduced contacts, right? That's a reflective measure. There's nothing we can do about it except look back. But the third piece that I think is important to note here with metrics is that they also enable us to understand, does this actually matter to us, right? In other words, they're affirmative. They answer the question of, does it matter? Yes or no? More importantly, why? And so before I dig deeper into first contact resolution, here's the number one mistake that I see businesses make. They measure first contact resolution because they attend a webinar like this, and they believe that first contact resolution is the thing they need to do, but it doesn't actually matter. They're not going to make any change based off of measuring that metric. And we're going to take a look at what can we do to make sure that if we're going to put it in place, like any good metric, that we're actually going to do something about it, which I think is really key as we think about this metric of first contact resolution. So let's break this down a little bit. And this is, I love this because this is how it can be so different at so many businesses. And what I'm going to tell you is not the right way. This is a way. You've got to figure out your way. But I think if we're going to talk about first contact resolution, there's two key things that we need to define as part of that conversation. Number one is, what do we mean by this idea of first contact? And I'll give you an example, maybe two different types of business models. For some businesses, they have it set up, and I know Martin's going to talk about digital channels. They have it set up that they would prefer to use their app or their website before talking to a representative. Well, suppose for a moment that they go to your app or they go to your website, they don't get the answer, and then they reach your contact center. And your contact center, the way it's set up is to treat them talking to that agent as the first contact. And it completely loses sight of the fact that this isn't actually their first time contacting people. In that case, you might be okay with it because what you're trying to do is understand once it gets to an agent, do they effectively resolve it? A different scenario, though, might be they call in and they reach an agent, and that agent is tier 1, and tier 1's job is to address all customers and identify where they need to go next. And maybe on a particular contact, an agent identifies that this should actually get escalated to tier 2. And so they move to tier 2, tier 2 effectively resolves it. And you decide, hey, our processes for tier 1 to do triage and maybe tier 2 to resolve. And as long as they do that appropriately, that's the first contact. Neither of those are wrong. It's just a matter of what does that business want to do about it. So your first step as you move forward from here is when you talk about something being done in a first contact, you've got to set some parameters on what does that actually look like. Second key question then to ask as part of that is when does resolution actually happen in your eyes? And another example of this is maybe an agent understands everything that the customer needed, and then at that point they have to move it on to another department. And you're just trying to understand, did the agent appropriately understand, address, and follow the right procedure? And in that case, you're saying, yeah, the agent resolved it in theirs. Now, is the entire issue resolved? No. But depending on what you might do, that might be part of how you measure it. Or let's take this example of something that happened to my wife. After we got married, she changed her name and contacted one of the credit card companies. She spoke to a lovely agent who gave her the impression that everything was taken care of. In fact, there was a survey right after that call that said, do you feel that your issue was effectively resolved today? And my wife gave a resounding yes. And I bet that business kind of gave themselves a high five or a pat on the back and said, great job. Well, in 30 days, the credit card bill came, and guess what? The name wasn't changed. Right. And so for that business, suddenly it causes a problem, which is why this third piece is really important, is you've actually got to make sure that, hey, if you've defined first contact and you've defined resolution, that it's actually then set in the parameters of something that you plan, will, or want to change. So if you're trying to understand how do we more effectively get rid of tier 1 doing triage and just get people right to the source, then maybe you do want to understand how many calls escalate from tier 1 to tier 2. If you're trying to make your self-service portals more effective, then maybe you do want to understand how many people abandon those experiences and have to go to a live agent, right? But if you just measure it to say, hey, this is our first contact resolution rate without any plans to do something about it, right? It's a worthless metric to you. And so let's then think, if we have a really good definition, which we're all going to go back and spend some time doing, what do we really need to do next? What do we need to do to get a meaningful take on first contact resolution in our business? One of the more common mistakes that I see is that we often look at it from one point of view. And so my belief is to get an effective picture of first contact resolution, we've got to have at least 2 vantage points. Number one vantage point, I think we should go to the customer and ask them, because I believe in most cases, the agent's going to do exactly what they're supposed to do. In most cases, they're doing the right thing. And so ask the customer. In the case of my wife, right? And there's a number of ways to pose this question, but ask the customer, do they believe that their issue was effectively resolved today? So you're going to capture that. And then you need to reconcile that against something internally. What do your systems tell you? In the case of the name change for the credit card, they should have had a mechanism in place, and maybe they did. I know they didn't, but a mechanism in place to say, hey, the customer told us it was resolved. Turns out we've run this audit report, and maybe it's based off of a repeat number coming back in. Maybe it's about referencing an issue code, whatever it might be for your business, and the length of time that the issue could reappear. And maybe it's a day, maybe it's a week, maybe it's a month, right? To be able to say, here's what the customer thought, here's what actually happened. And now we've got the real picture of whether or not we're achieving first contact resolution. So few questions to get us started, but ultimately I think it comes down to these 3 things I want to leave you with. Number one is, if you want to get first contact resolution right, you've got to clearly define what you mean, not what we mean, but what you mean by resolving something in the first contact. You've got to measure from multiple perspectives. So it's not just about what the agent says or what the customer says or what the systems, but a way of looking at those diverse perspectives And then lastly, with any good metric, do something about it. And so I know you're going to hear some really great advice from Martin and Kristen as we go on, but that's my point of view. Clearly define it, measure from multiple perspectives, but at the end of the day, do something to make a change.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much for that, Justin. I think there's some real words of wisdom in there. In the audience, you could just say what you liked about Justin's presentation. I love the fact that certain things will deliver certain outcomes. So if we do this, then this should happen. I think it's a great way of looking at things. What do we mean by first contact resolution? Is it when they actually first contacted you directly, or is that actually when they first hit the app? When does resolution happen? Is it you've done everything you can on the day or on the call or on the contact, or is it the entire issue? And I think one of the key ones I think is, what does the customer think, and how does that tally against what your systems are telling you? Because in many ways those should be linked, and I guess there's one of the problems. There's a bit of a disconnect between that. So if you'd just like to put in what you liked about Justin's presentation. The chat room has been absolutely humming. If you're not already logged into the chat room, then very easy to get into there. You just type in, probably the quickest way is just put in cch.chat into your browser, or if you want to spell it out longer, callcenterhelper.com/chat. We've got less than half the audience logged into the chat room. So there's a very active discussion going on there. So let's pick up a couple of tips. Jake has said, depending on your demographic, providing self-service options, either via a website, online account, or mobile app, can divert a lot of traffic away from the phones. Just bear in mind that the older demographic tend to prefer personal touch and like talking to an agent. So I think that's a very good words of advice. Justin, here's an interesting one. Tipping the bucket. Get the caller to raise all of the questions they have and deal with them all before leaving the call. I guess that's often in conflict with average handling time.
I mean, so we have to ask the question, right? What matters more, having the customer satisfied and the issue resolved, and the chance of us having to spend more time, right? You think ultimately, if you spend 2 more minutes on it now, or an additional 4 or 5 or 6 minutes if they have to call back, right? What really matters to you? But what I like about this tip sentence is actually gets at this idea of a metric we haven't really touched on, but that's about next issue avoidance, right? It's not just about what did they contact you about right now, but how do we anticipate and prepare? And ideally, if we're doing our job, they shouldn't be the one raising the questions. We should be thinking of the customers who are in your type of situation often also ask or need or want this. Let me help you navigate that, right? That to me is really at the pinnacle of what great experiences are all about.
And Martin, that ties in very well with what Justin was saying there. Susan said, as part of our member survey at the conclusion of the call, we used the question, my questions, concerns were addressed on this call. We can then review those survey calls and determine what could be improved. And this, I think, ties in with Justin's comment. We also don't use average handling time as part of the stick equation for metrics to ensure that our reps don't feel too pressured to get off the phone quickly. Martin?
Well, I mean, average handle time effectively is rationing the availability of your service from the customer's perspective. You're saying that they're only allowed to have a certain amount of time to get their thing fixed. And contextually, I think this fits very powerfully into how do you see the service as being a reactive one or a proactive one? In other words, do you want to condemn yourself and your team to working faster and harder or smarter, which is the proactive approach? And, you know, there is a huge change going on at the moment at the technology level of enabling us to see patterns of behavior and therefore anticipate what customers want and need and all that kind of good stuff. But just from the human level of the sheer level of effort, we really should be always trying to be smarter. And Justin's absolutely on the money to say, find out what they want now, but also find out what they could want at the end of the day. And it's a far more effective thing to drive that, because at the end of the day, you know, service is a point of reference for the customer vis-a-vis their relationship to the brand, their sense of loyalty, their propensity to purchase, and all the rest of the stuff that goes there. The last 18 months has made us much more short-tempered anyway, and much more prone to taking umbrage when things don't work. And so, to my mind, when everyone's trying to rebuild their revenues post-COVID, it makes no sense at all to be having a leaky bucket and losing customers. And the very least you can do is to deliver on what the expectation is.
And Kristen, I guess the expectation Martin's talking about there is in some ways a promise that you're effectively, and Catherine has said, follow through on promises made
Absolutely.
to customers. Use a calendar, for instance, to book all such promises for an agent to call. It could be a calendar, I guess, built into the CRM system, or even just a paper diary. So I think that whole concept, Kristen, of promises is quite important.
It's quite important and it's quite accurate, right? I mean, as a customer, when I contact you about an issue and you tell me that you're going to issue a refund, or that agent talks to Justin's wife, right? She certainly expected, to her, that was a promise that was made to her that was going to be resolved. And when it's not, it it evokes the same sort of challenge in the relationship between the consumer and your brand that a broken promise does in any relationship.
So I think that's probably a good point then to hand across to Martin. And I think you were going to be looking at some of the areas of what is driving some of the repeat contacts.
Yes, indeed. And just to sort of mirror something that I'm seeing in the chat window at the moment, which I think has been debated, focus on being effective rather than being efficient. It's a much smarter way of getting outcomes. And by the way, you get efficiency as a byproduct of effectiveness. So there's something to think about. Okay, so let's have a view on a topic I'd like to talk about, something I've noticed a lot. It's just a scene set here. We've had a situation where you've heard over and over that, more's happened in the last 18 months around digital first agendas than the last 6 years or whatever. There has been an undoubted acceleration because we've had to, been stuck at home, find new ways of engaging in a contactless way. Brands have taken the opportunity to push the pedal down in terms of their digital first agendas. That's all been well and dandy. However, the speed at which that has been done has also had a consequence, and I think that we need to revisit some of the consequences that are taking place. That also, I might say, picked up on an existing momentum of variously called omnichannel, multi-channel, whatever you want, giving choice to customers. And certainly, one of the byproducts of the pandemic has been a very strong demand for human assistance, particularly if your problems are emotive and complex. Banks have been flooded out, travel companies flooded out, health services flooded out. As a result, we've had to find alternative channels in order to do that, which is then driven self-service, et cetera, et cetera. So the point I would like to make here is contained in this first slide, really, which is around the point that we've got to focus not just upon trying to encourage this new way of engaging, but we've really got to focus upon reducing the underlying complexity, because unless we do that, it's going to take multiple times in order to get the outcome that the customer wants. So talking about an idea which has probably been around for a while now, but is worth revisiting, is if you talk about what experience is, you can certainly slice it in three ways. One is the outcome, which is actually what first contact resolution is, the outcome. There is then the amount of effort you have to put into that, and then finally there's the associated emotion that goes with that. Those are the three things that in a very practical way provide you with the ability to measure a customer experience. And effort is of equal importance to the other two, and it's interesting to see how much you really have to dial into reducing effort, cognitive overload for a customer before you get rewarded. So this piece of research from the Qualtrics Institute, which is a global study, I think I'm right in saying, yep, is that you've got to be right at the top of that tree if you are going to expect customers to have a propensity to buy more, recommend the company, forgive, trust, etc., etc., etc. So associated with our ability to deliver first-time resolution is also the point about making it easy. In other words, the path from where they choose to start to the outcome that they require is not full of barriers, complexities, do it more than once and all the rest of the stuff. So coming back to the point I made earlier on, we had to iterate very quickly in this last period of time. And oftentimes what has taken place is that you'll find yourself in a situation where parts of the overall journey work, but parts do not. Often a function of the fact that so-called digital first teams maybe agile, or organized, cross-functional, et cetera, will have architected something great, such as an app, such as maybe a bot for initial triage purposes, something else that has taken place. And that's nice, that's fast, that's all exciting, and the customer's pretty up for that. And then suddenly it trips into the same old, which has got all the kind of associated legacy problems that we know for years and years and years, which is that we have to repeat it. It kind of is a mashup of digital and analog still, quite a lot of effort involved, quite a lot of manual at the end of the day. And so we have probably made a mistake in terms of thinking that all we've got to concentrate on is the so-called digital part of this. And simply sticking that on the front end of existing processes really doesn't work. And it is not sufficient if you're going to get there. And to provide a little bit more evidence of what that means in practice, let's apply that notion to maybe omnichannel. You might well have added 2 or 3 other ways in which you could engage to the customer in order to be able to provide them with alternatives to maybe just the phone channel. Trouble is, are you actually also architecting the underlying service journey to enable them to get to the outcome that they want? And the evidence here is no, we're not. Because what's happening is that whilst I might have started in a preferred channel, I am being forced more often than not to change tack and to find another way to get to that outcome. And indeed, guess what? We don't like that. So if we choose to change channel because that's our own decision, then that's got minimal impact in terms of satisfaction or criticism of the experience. But if you force them to make that decision, you lose a lot of brownie points extremely quickly as far as their view of that experience is concerned. I can give my own story very quickly on that, which is that I work with a certain insurance organization for car insurance. They provided me with an app. I thought that sounds great. I got into the app. I noticed that I could actually make a claim. I had to, by the way, because my windscreen had just received a crack that needed urgently replacing. It said they could do that and I could do it over chat. What you're looking at the screen is a screen grab of literally the last thing that was told to me, which is having had a great conversation with a charming person. They said, oh, I'm terribly sorry. Here we go. You can't do it over this modality and you can't actually get the result that you want, despite the fact that the app advertised the opportunity to be able to do it in that particular way. So I had to reverse out of that. I had to phone. Guess what? The phone doesn't work. Are there alternative phone numbers on the website? Of course there aren't any, because they've all been removed, because we've invested all our money in chat and also in an app, because we had to do an ROI on that. So of course, we've had to downgrade something else to convince the finance people that there's a great new way of doing it. Here's the silver bullet. And at the end of the day, what I had to do was actually go back to the chat person who said, look, I'm not meant to tell you this, but I'm going to break process. Here's the 3 telephone numbers of the people who do supply the replacement windscreen. I talked to 2, they couldn't do it fast enough. The 3rd person could do it fast enough, but said, I'm sorry, we don't have back-to-back relationships with your particular insurance company. So you're going to have to pay the full cost of the windscreen and then you claim it back from your insurance company, which eventually I actually got round it in another way. But there's a classic example of offering channels which subsequently don't deliver the promise. And secondly, the underlying process in terms of the service experience isn't tight. So I couldn't do what I tried to do in spite of the fact it was promoted to me at the end of the day. So we've all got those stories at the end of the day. Here's another example of what takes place. You may well have been encouraging people to go through another modality. In certain parts of the world, messaging really has flourished in the last 18 months. Apps have probably flourished. Trying to get conversational AI up and running has flourished to some degree. And yet, looking at the reality of life, can we use those things to get to the outcome, the resolution? Appears not. More often than not, when you ask the customer, what channel did you start on and end on, we're still ending on the good old traditional human-based forms of engagement, the 2 most popular ones being phone and email at the end of the day. That's got to be a clue around the fact that you haven't architected the journey to work in the way that you initially promoted that promise. So what to do about that? Well, I've got a couple of examples to demonstrate that in some respects, this doesn't have to be a massively complicated or over-engineered thing. It requires empathy in the sense of imagining what it's going to be like in the customer's shoes and just doing some smart, simple things to enable it. And this is a lovely example. It's a real one. It's a recent one as well, based on the fact that Finland as a nation wanted to attract more inward investment from foreign businesses. And as a result of that, recognized that, they're going to have to do a number of things to get on board, such as, registration, patent officers, the business of immigration, the business of tax administration, etc. Now, being government, it's obviously going to be sitting in different departments, which means probably different budgets, different websites, etc., etc. Did they want their new potential investors to go through the additional complexity of finding those URLs, finding where they were on those sites and all the rest of it? And they decided, no, that was unnecessary. So they did a very simple thing, but very effective thing. They said, let's recognize, which we can do anyway with any conversational AI, what the limitations of their intent range is, and also recognize the other intents from the other from the other bots that can provide that service, and simply provide a sort of handover experience between the different areas of competency. But the neat thing here is that rather than expecting you to move to another site, you can do that within the single pane of glass that's already been provided with. So therefore, there's no additional cognitive effort from the customer's point of view. They can get all of those services experienced within the one thing. It's not a difficult thing to do, required imagination, required an outside-in style of thinking in order to be able to affect that outcome. And if you get this stuff right, I've got two examples to bring to the table for you around of a current myth, which is that bots don't work, conversational AI doesn't work, it really isn't very good, which is going around and is actually based upon the reasons that I've just been debating. However, if you get the fundamentals right and you architect it in a way that works, you can then drive really remarkable levels of self-service. These are both two organizations that I know from the position of me being a judge and listening to them providing their particular examples. And in both cases, conversational AI or self-service is now the dominant channel. It has more than 50% of all inbound volumes being satisfactorily dealt with first time as a result of the way that they've set up their services. Gusto, if you don't know them, provides food in terms of deliverable meals, and the Very Group is a retail orientated organization and also a provider of finances for that at the end of the day. So two examples to bring to bear, both of them doing more than 50%. That's where we should be as an industry. Where we're often though is still a broken phase, because what we've done is add digital on and therefore provided greater complexity. And in the context of our conversation today, which is to get to first-time resolution, we've got to get underneath the surface of that and reduce it, simplify it, in order to allow customers to get to that outcome. So those are my messages in my particular part of this conversation. And I'll hand you back to John T on that basis. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for that, Martin. Some fabulous bits there. We're going to jump across into the chat room. So if you're not already logged into the chat room, now's the time to do it. Probably the easiest way to do it is type in callcenterhelper.com/chat, or just type in cch.chat into your browser as we're running that in the chat room. While you're doing that, if you can, if you're already logged into the chat room, if you just type in what you like best about Martin's presentation. There's certainly some bits I loved. There's a really strong demand for human assistance. Just adding digital doesn't improve first contact resolution. In fact, that could actually make it worse. Customers will always find the easiest path, and it's really important to get underneath the surface, simplify, and reduce customer effort. So some very salient words of wisdom there. So if you just like to pop that in, particularly if you're expecting a wow level of service. Right, we're going to jump across to the quiz room. We're going to be asking the questions. The buttons here at the bottom of your mobile phone when you're in chat room, or at the bottom of your screen, just click on the button, the blue, red, green, or orange buttons, and then you can vote there. So select the color relevant. So let's just jump into the chat room. We've got about 75% of you logged in. I'll just give you a minute or two to log in. So let's just do the first question. True or false? Over a third of contact centers do not measure first contact resolution. So press A if you think that statement is true, or B, the red button, if you think that statement is false. True or false? Over a third of contact centers do not measure first contact resolution. So let's have a look at the results for that. Oh, a few more votes coming through there. So true, yes, most of you get that right, according to a call center helper survey. Over 34% of contact centers do not measure contact center first contact resolution. So let's have a look at, and what's the most common method of measuring first contact resolution? Is it asking the customer during the contact? Is it a post-contact survey? Is it repeat contacts in a given time frame? Or is it repeat contact reason codes in the CRM system? What do you believe is the most common method of measuring first contact resolution? So just vote A, B, C, or D. Let's have a look at the results. Okay, not many of you got that one right, in the minority. It is indeed no repeat contacts within a given time frame is the most common, though it is a fairly widespread, followed by post-contact surveys and so on, asking the customer. So there's the leaderboard so far. And which of the following first contact resolution practices is not a great idea? So what's not a great idea? Is it A, determining repeat contact drivers? Is it B, fixing broken processes? Is it C, measuring first contact resolution in isolation? Or is it D, setting realistic customer expectations? So which of those four do you think is not a great idea? So I'd just like to select which one you think is the least good of those ideas. And yeah, most of you got that right. Measuring first contact center resolution is in isolation. If you got high first contact resolution rates, that's often because many queries are easy to answer. Yet, will your customers be happier having to phone in instead of using self-service? Probably not. So measure FCR in tandem with other metrics. And the last question we've got is, who said not everything that counts can be counted, and not everything that can be counted counts? Was it A, Albert Einstein, B, Marie Curie, C, Stephen Hawking, or D, Thomas Edison? So who once said not everything that counts can be counted, not everything that can be counted counts? So let's have a look. Okay, the right answer to that one is Albert Einstein. And the quote makes us think back to the point that just because you can measure a metric doesn't mean you can manage it. In fact, there's a quite interesting law called Goodhearts Law, which, to paraphrase, says effectively a good metric stops becoming a good metric when it becomes a target. So quite key there. So let's have a look. Michael 71 is the winner of the prize there. So congratulations, Michael. We'll be in touch and send the prize on to you there. So let's probably a good chance now. Let's jump across to Kristen, and perhaps Kristen, if you'd like to share with us your thoughts on how to improve first contact resolution.
Sure, of course, I'd love to.
So I'm going to, in the interest of time, since we lost a couple minutes there, I'm going to move quickly, but I think we talked before about some of these really common ways of measuring, right? There's sort of this concept of, I'm going to look within a certain time period and see, did this customer contact us multiple times? That can get tricky if I don't know if the customer hops channels, depending on how I'm measuring it. If I don't know that the same, phone number is associated with this email address, as an example. And then there's the issue of, we're going to ask them, right? The agent's going to ask them, or the agent's going to tell us it was resolved, or we're going to do some sort of follow-up survey. But the one piece that I think we haven't talked about that I actually really like to see layered on to any of these other measurements that you're using is to use, interaction analytics, speech or text analytics is the easiest, but obviously could also and should be doing it with your quality assurance reps as well, right? If you're doing a quality assurance process, this is one of those things that they should always be listening for, are phrases that tell us we've got a problem, so that we can track them and understand root cause, right? So things like, I sent an email about this last week. This is the third time I've had to contact you guys about this, right? Those should always be tracked. And then we can go back and see whatever method we're using for measuring first contact resolution, did it catch this? Because from the customer's perspective, they're telling us they didn't consider this a resolved issue, right? So again, I'll go back to Justin's wife issue. Siri's trying to talk to me. I'll go back to Justin's wife's issue, right? To say, that contact center likely marked that as a resolved issue, but in fact, she would not certainly consider it resolved. It was not resolved. So that's a good way to sort of pick up on those situations. The other thing that is important to think about is, as we move to more omni-channel communications, we have some channels that are what we call synchronous. So synchronous channels means that, phone is the easiest example, right? It means that this is happening in real time, back and forth. So you say something, I hear you, I respond to you, you respond to me, but it could also be like live chat or some messaging apps where, we see those three little dots that say this person's typing and then they're going to respond and I'm going to respond to them. In that, it gets tricky, particularly as we get into digital channels, with how do I measure, one resolution in that context. But normally, because it's in real time, there's sort of a beginning, there's some back and forth, and then there's an end, right? Where it gets even more difficult is when we go to what we call asynchronous channels. So asynchronous channels would be channels where both parties communicate at different times. So it could be an email. If you think about that, that's an easy way to think of an asynchronous, or old school, right? A letter in the mail, and then we respond, right? That was when I first started in contact centers, we still did that a lot. That written correspondence was certainly asynchronous. There were potentially, days, weeks in between. But if you think about the technology today that we're doing that's asynchronous, a lot of it is messaging apps or SMS, or it could be email. But in many of these channels, the customer can see the history. So it might be 9 months later, and they come on, and just like with their friends, they want to be able to pick up that conversation and say, hey, I'm just realizing this is happening again. Well, when they say, hey, I'm just realizing this is happening again, first of all, is the agent able to see? In many cases, they're not, right? The rest of that conversation from 9 months ago. Second of all, do we flag that as the customer saying it's happening again? Was this not resolved the first time? Well, it was 9 months before, probably an isolated issue. I'm not here to give all the answers to this because this is going to depend on your business. I'm just sort of trying to shine a light on this is complicated. How we measure FCR is getting more and more complicated because we have all of these different channels of communication. And in many cases, it's not just isolated to one channel, right? It's moving across, and maybe different people are touching it. So one of the things that that many of the customers of Playvox use our workforce management for is to be able to stitch together all of the different activities and to be able to measure sort of an overall handle time for a customer issue. But many times in that circumstance, we see multiple channels and we see multiple employees handling it. So if if I'm only measuring first contact resolution for my frontline agents, but refunds are issued through a back office department, is it not incredibly important to measure that back office employee doing their job the first time that it comes through, because that impacts the customer's perception of whether or not we've got first contact resolution. And the more I learn about how these stitch together in this modern omni-channel age where we're where customers are jumping across channels, the more I can predict, okay, we've all talked about it, right? A lot of things end with the phone. I'm going to, when it hits these 3 stages, it's likely I'm going to get a phone call. And so we actually start to, with machine learning, use that to predict for scheduling purposes, right? So it creates a more intelligent forecast that say in real time, I can tell because this has happened and this has happened, this is likely to happen. And so I know that my volumes are potentially going to change from what I thought they were. But, you know, regardless of sort of the technology, if we just step back and look at the challenge, there is this question that we have to ask ourselves of, you know, how do we evolve FCR, this metric that we've loved, many of us have used for a long time now, right? Because it is that magic metric that improvements therein not only create better customer experiences when done right, but they also create better operations and lower costs. And so it's a metric that we love, but I think it has to evolve. And I think that's what we're all sort of saying here, has to evolve to some degree for a modern sort of digital first omni-channel world. And so we have to start asking ourselves, are we measuring, when we say first contact resolution, are we measuring resolution for this conversation, for this distinct moment in time? Are we measuring resolution for the department, right? It was resolution for the contact center, but now someone in back office needs to do something, or it's a tier 1, it's going to tier 2. You know, now it's up to tier 2. Is it that it was resolved for the customer, and maybe that's multiple handle points? So again, just questions to ask yourselves as you think through this particular metric, and I'll be curious in the chat to see what everybody thinks and what you're doing now. I thought very quickly I would just leave you with one of the more practical pieces of advice that I like to give people when we think about any metric actually that we're measuring in contact center, which is, you know, metrics often by their very nature are what we would call lag indicators, meaning by the time I see it, it's already happened. And so while that's always going to be the case, I want to understand, are there behaviors that I can coach to, that I can understand earlier in the chain, coach to throughout, so that I can start to create for myself some lead indicators, or earlier indicators at least, maybe not ahead of, but earlier indicators that will help me to see, you know, help me to derive that metric, what that end result is. And so I like to suggest that people use processes that they already have, even if you don't have a technology. If you're doing this in spreadsheets, right? However you're doing it, you're probably doing some sort of quality assurance or quality audit or quality management process. So these are some questions that you can put in your form that we've found historically correlate pretty well. Depending on your business, one of these may stand out more than another, but correlate pretty well to FCR. And so you can start to understand at an individual employee level how they're doing on this and be able to coach to it. One of the examples that that I've seen that was, you know, sort of not as maybe obvious as some of the others was we found strong correlation with an agent who just didn't speak with a lot of conveyed competence. This was a very smart person who was giving the right answers, but they had this habit of sort of always qualifying what they said. So I think this, or this is probably what you need to do. And the customer would feel like, I'm not sure this person understood how to resolve my issue. And so they would sort of end that phone call or that chat. And in this case, it was phone calls. And they would call back and try to, you know, take their pick, try to get another agent. And so we were able to identify that behavior for that particular person. So be open-minded. There are a lot of behaviors that can actually correlate and that can drive repeat contacts. Just really quickly about playbacks before I pass it back, because some of you may not be familiar with playbacks. So we're very focused on sort of omni-channel and digital. If you're familiar with workforce optimization, workforce management, forecasting, scheduling, adherence, your quality, your performance, your coaching, all of those things, you know, that's sort of what we do, but we really do it for a digital first contact center especially. So Jonty, I think we've touched on a lot of pieces of this, but I'm anxious to hear what everybody has to say and what tips they have.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much for that indeed. We're just asking a question. If you'd like to see a demonstration of the Playbox solution, just put that up on the poll in front of you. Would be good. So Kristen, thank you very much for that indeed. I thought there's some great perspectives there. So is first contact resolution for the conversation? Is it for the department, or is it for the customer? So I think that's quite key. And I think also building first contact resolution into the QM program is very important. Can you identify any lead indicators that will help you see future problems? Right, we've got a lot of tips and questions coming through from the audience. So let's just have a look at some of them. Jake, I think, is trying to win the prize here. We used dynamic routing to evaluate why a customer is calling us, and will automatically direct them to the appropriate team. I think it's a nice one here, Kristen. Saves time and prevents the customer talking to 2 or 3 individual agents. They get the call through to the right place. What's your thought on that, Kristen?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's one of the things that we see done a lot as well. It certainly enables us to take some clues from that initial, and I should say in digital channels, we often measure first reply time. So it takes that very first part of the conversation that's very key, or the first email, and we can understand through the conversation, through some of the keywords or things that the customer says, where that should go, and it allows us to get it to the right place to get that first reply time more quickly. So sort of different metric than first contact resolution, but very much related. And
Justin Jill says, we review calls longer than 20 minutes to determine if there are opportunities for improvement. Justin, possibly our customers are not aware of automation that is available. There may be some area for automation we can discover by reviewing these calls. I think Justin's on mute.
Yeah, I mean, I think you know what your outliers are, right? So I think it's good to have a practice for going after them and understanding what you can learn from them. You know, what's interesting about this to me, I'd maybe challenge is like, how many people and how much time do you spend and how many 20-minute calls do you have? Is there any way that you can even, you talk about customers not being aware of automation. Are there some ways that you can automate those long interactions to call insights? And are there common words or things that happen during those long calls?
And Martin, you talked about promises and expectations. Aaron has said, make sure the agents are managing expectations of the customer of the upstream processes. If this is a change to account is going to cause a letter to be sent with X, Y, and Z on it, this can prevent the customer panic when they see the letter and contact you again. I think that's quite a strong thing of setting the expectation of what the upstream promise is going to do.
Well, I think explaining how things are going to work absolutely makes sense. Otherwise, people are going to go, I mean, the number of times that you just after the event think, oh gosh, I didn't find out about that, and therefore to come back into the thing, and therefore to give complete, full answers that are informative and anticipate potentially the next question. That's just smart, you know. So at the end of the day, it's all to do with setting up a discipline, which I don't know if we've spent enough time talking about, which is really to be constantly reviewing the whole journey through the lens of the customer experience, their way of thinking, their way of seeing it, what you can discover from interaction analytics, and start to package up responses which anticipate, are fuller, are more likely to drive happiness and satisfaction, also less stressful from the advisor perspective, and work on the basis that doing it well is always going to end up with a better outcome long term than doing it badly and doing it tactically. I do remember doing a piece of work a long time ago for a council where they had clocks on the desk. I tell, I'm not a kid, and an alarm would go out silently, at least from the listener's point of view. That's the amount of time that you've got. And they absolutely bombed out their queue because everyone was forced straight back into the queue again. It was a local council. It was the most insane thing, but it was actually what they were doing.
Sunny has come back and say, find alternate options if the answer has to be a no. Quite often the answer will be a no, but there are different ways of doing that. And rather than saying, no, we can't do that, sometimes if you can point the customer in a direction that says, I think that was your example, Martin, earlier. You know, the answer is no, but I can at least help you get on the route. If we can't help you. Interesting, Aaron has said, Justin, this ties in quite well. In my opinion, AHT should only be used by the planning team for forecasting and not presented to agents.
Yeah, so I remarked on something similar in the chat. Look, AHT is for workforce management. It's an outcome based off of us following the right processes, our systems, how complex things are. We need to focus on making sure agents are doing the right things, that systems are, you know, easy to navigate, that processes aren't overly complicated. If we focus on those, AHT will normalize to where AHT is going to normalize. You can't focus on the number without understanding the behaviors driving it.
And Kristen, I guess this ties in with your comment about was the resolution for the conversation, the department or the customer, what does the customer think? There's no point if all processes are ticked, but the customer thinks the query is unresolved.
Absolutely. That is absolutely key, right? And so I do think it's important to measure. I mean, I think I would actually vote for all three, right? I think it's important to measure those components so that you can understand and start to, you know, turn the dial and start to improve them. But I think the ultimate measure has to be, what does the customer think?
Yeah, and I think Justin's point earlier about calibration between all three is really key there. Unfortunately, that's the end of our 300th webinar. What did you like about it? If you could just leave us a little comment in the chat room. Today's winning tip, that is Kelly. Kelly says, controversially, FCR means nothing if the agent journey is too difficult to navigate. How can an agent give a great experience if their own experience is terrible? Get the agent journey right, and FCR should be the natural outcome instead of chasing it like an out of reach target. So that's certainly a more controversial view. If you could complete the survey when you leave, it's only 4 questions long, would be great to do. You can get a recording of today's webinar in about 45 minutes. There's still a chance if you want to join us next week to look at 10 ways to improve employee engagement. Just go to callcenterhelper.com/webinars. And just like to thank you to all of our speakers. Justin, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Johnny.
And thank you, Martin, for joining us as well.
Pleasure.
And Kristen, thanks for dialing in. And thanks to the entire audience. We'll be back next week looking at how we can improve the employee experience. Thanks then. Bye-bye.